It begins, as so many modern stories do, with two teenagers and a phone. Before the headlines, before the legal arguments that would ripple across the country, there were just two names exchanged on a screen, Conrad and Michelle. Two young people who felt older than their years because of the weight they were already carrying, and yet still unmistakably adolescent in their longing to be seen, to be chosen, to matter deeply to someone. Their relationship did not unfold in crowded hallways or long walks after school. Instead, it lived almost entirely in text bubbles, tiny gray and blue rectangles that would come to hold unbearable significance. They met in person only a handful of times, but they messaged constantly. That detail alone says much about the world they inhabited. Intimacy built through devices, affection translated into typed words, and silence interpreted through read receipts rather than facial expressions. Both struggled with isolation. Conrad Roy had a complicated inner life marked by pressure, self-doubt, and episodes of deep sadness. Michelle Carter, too, wrestled with her own mental health challenges, social insecurity, and a desperate desire to feel indispensable. Their bond grew in that fragile space where empathy, dependence, and fear intermingle. At first, their conversations carried the tender energy of two teenagers trying to help each other through emotional storms. They shared worries, dreams, and frustration about family, about friends who did not understand, about feeling like outsiders in their own lives. Michelle often expressed care, admiration, and concern. Conrad often confided his darkest thoughts. What made their connection powerful was not proximity, but intensity. Each message was immediate, unfiltered, and preserved a diary that talked back. Gradually, though, the tone shifted. Not all at once, but in small turns that are easier to see when looking backward than they ever could have been in the moment. What had begun as mutual support started to revolve around one central, terrifying theme: Conrad's suicidal ideation. He spoke about his hopelessness and about feeling trapped inside a pain he could not name. Michelle listened, responded, and occupied the role of confidant. That role carried weight, and she embraced it, sometimes urging him to seek help, sometimes saying he could get through it, sometimes signaling that she was the only person who truly understood him. That mixture of affection, exclusivity, dependence created a potent emotional bubble. For Conrad, Michelle became the person he could say the unsayable to. For Michelle, Conrad's vulnerability became a place where she felt important. The relationship did not exist under the healthy light of steady friendships and adult guidance. It existed mostly in private digital space, where words travel fast and consequences feel abstract. They were teenagers, still forming identities, and trying to navigate problems much larger than they were prepared for. As Conrad's struggles deepened, the conversations around life and death became more frequent, more explicit, and more alarming. This is where many listeners feel a sharp tension sympathy for two young people in pain, fear how far the dialogue had drifted, anger at the imbalance of influence that would soon be alleged. Michelle's messages increasingly shifted from listening in comfort toward normalizing the idea of ending things, framing his despair as something inevitable rather than something to be treated. The language of support blurred into something darker, an emotional logic in which exit was spoken of not as a tragedy to be prevented, but as a decision to be followed through. It is crucial to understand the context without sensationalizing it. No monsters, no melodrama, only human vulnerability at a dangerous intersection with modern communication. The power dynamics between two teenagers are rarely straightforward. Michelle was not physically present as a threat. She did not wield a weapon. What she had was access immediate, constant, relentless into the mind of someone already standing near the edge. Words became the instrument at issue, and the case would later turn on the question of how powerful those words were allowed to be. Before the courtroom debates, before experts and statutes, there's a more human picture. Messages arriving late at night, a phone glowing in the dark, two young people believing they were alone in the world and talking in absolutes. Conrad spoke of feeling like a burden and of being tired of fighting himself. Michelle began responding less with hesitation and more with certainty. The evolution is part of what makes the story so unsettling. It is not a sudden snap, but a slow redefinition of what consolation sounded like. Around them, families loved them and worried about them, but so much was happening behind the locked screen. To parents, teachers, and friends, fragments appeared, indications of struggle, attempts at help, counseling visits, moments of seeming normalcy. But the totality of the conversation lived in the digital archive between them, word stacked upon word, promise upon promise, pressure woven into care. There is tragedy in that hiddenness, a community that might have intervened had it known the exact contours of dialogue. Michelle's inner world also matters without excusing or ignoring harm. She battled her own loneliness, an intense desire to be needed, and mental health issues documented in the record. She sought attention, validation, and sometimes imagined herself in dramatic roles where she could save or stand beside someone in crisis. When the narrative shifted from "how do we get you help" to "this is your decision," she did not pull back. Instead, her identity merged with the role of the person who would not abandon him in the darkest choice imaginable. That psychological entanglement, unhealthy and untested by adult perspective, became one of the central threads later examined. For the first 5 minutes of hearing this case, many people experience conflicting emotions. Sorrow for two struggling teenagers, outrage at the messages that appear to push him toward despair, confusion at how such a situation can unfold largely unnoticed, and unease about how accountability should be assigned when words, not actions in the traditional sense, are involved. That emotional complexity is part of why this story captivated the public. It asks uncomfortable questions about digital life, mental health, and responsibility that do not yield easy answers. And then the irreversible moment arrives, not described here in graphic detail, because the point of this story is not spectacle, but consequence. Conrad died by suicide in 2014. In the aftermath, grief spread through his family and community, searching for understanding in the wake of an unbearable loss. In his phone were messages, thousands of them, including exchanges with Michelle from the hours and days before his death. Those messages would not only provide a window into his final months, they would become the foundation of a criminal prosecution unlike any before it. In the days that followed, Michelle's words came under microscopic scrutiny. One message she sent to a friend afterward, referencing a call in which she said she told Conrad to go through with it, will become infamous and deeply contested in public opinion. The idea that someone's text messages could be interpreted as pushing another toward death struck many as morally outrageous, others as legally tenuous, and still others as a tragic collision of untreated illness and poor judgment. But regardless of viewpoint, one fact remained: a young man was gone, and what had been spoken in private was now evidence. Section 1 is the story before the courtroom, before laws were cited and precedents debated. It is the story of two isolated teenagers whose relationship formed in the glow of a screen, where empathy and manipulation collided, where affection and pressure became tangled, and where the line between support and coercion blurred in real time. It invites us to look closely not only at what was said, but at the vulnerabilities that made those words matter so much. The rest of the case, the charges, the verdict, the national argument about speech and responsibility will come later. But everything begins here, with messages, with need, and with the devastating reality that words can shape actions in ways none of them fully understood until it was too late. The story of Michelle Carter and Conrad Roy turned from private struggle to public shock through something deceptively simple: words. Not shouts in a crowded room, not commands barked face to face, but small messages sent across a phone screen casual in appearance, devastating in consequence. When investigators began piecing together the timeline of Conrad's final days, they found that his conversations with Michelle formed a running commentary on his fear, his doubt, and his wavering between wanting to live and wanting the pain to stop. Embedded in those messages was a central question of the case: how far can language go in steering another person's most irreversible decision? The text revealed how their communication had reached a dangerous intensity. Conrad expressed ambivalence, moments of despair interrupted by hesitation, flickers of hope, and anxiety about how his family would be shattered. Again and again, he worried aloud about hurting the people who loved him. These messages mattered because they showed he was not simply fixed on one course. He was conflicted, leaning in multiple directions at once. He voiced both fatigue with life and a wish that something might change. Inside those tensions, the role of the person responding becomes enormously consequential. Michelle's responses, preserved verbatim in digital records, showed a change over time. Earlier in their relationship, she had sometimes urged him to seek treatment and open up to others. By the final stretch, however, her tone had shifted toward insistence. She began framing his decision as already made, discouraging him from backing away, minimizing his fears about the effect on his family, and presented herself as the one person who truly understood and would stand by him if he followed through. To many who later read the exchanges, the words took on the feel of a script: reassurance mixed with pressure, empathy braided with fatalism. This is the portion of the case that leaves many observers feeling a knot in the stomach. We're used to thinking of harm as something we can see: a push, a blow, a weapon. Here, the alleged instrument was persuasion, repetition, emotional leverage. Michelle encouraged Conrad not to tell others, narrowing his circle of support at a time when intervention could have saved him. She framed hesitation as a failure rather than a chance to seek help. She positioned herself as both confidant and arbiter, responding to his doubts with certainty and to his fear with goading rather than retreat. At the same time, the defense would later emphasize, Michelle was not a villain from a script. She was a teenager grappling with her own insecurity, craving significance, and dealing with documented mental health struggles. Her messages showed confusion, fantasy, and an intense desire to be central in a tragic narrative. Some texts she sent to friends afterwards seemed to place herself into that narrative in ways that felt jarring, claiming a pivotal role, hinting that she had told him not to back out, and envisioning herself as the grieving girlfriend whose story would finally bring her attention and belonging. Those messages became important not only legally but morally, raising uncomfortable questions about motivation, self-image, and the impact of social isolation. What makes this part of the story so haunting is the ordinariness of the medium. There is nothing exotic about texting. It happens everywhere, on buses, in bedrooms, in classrooms, under dinner tables. The very familiarity of it makes the case unsettling. If words sent so casually can carry such weight, the digital world we inhabit suddenly feels more fragile. The phone stops being a simple tool and becomes a conduit of influence powerful enough to change the course of a life. For parents and educators, it was a chilling realization an entire emotional universe can unfold in private, with no outward sign until it's too late. Conrad's final hours reflected the terrible push and pull of ambivalence. He expressed fear. He expressed second thoughts. He sought reassurance. And the responses he received from Michelle, rather than reinforcing the value of staying alive or directing him to immediate, concrete help, repeatedly framed his doubts as something to overcome. For prosecutors, this was the heart of the case, not a single sentence, but a pattern. Not one dramatic instruction, but a sustained chorus pushing in one direction, while discouraging lifelines that pointed in another. Yet it is important to state clearly what this narrative is not. It is not a suggestion that words alone always create responsibility for another's self-destruction. It is not a simple equation or an easy moral lesson. The law is careful for a reason. Many people talk about despair without acting on it. Many people say terrible things they do not fully mean. What made this case different in the eyes of the court was a convergence of vulnerability, proximity in time, explicit pressure, and the knowledge that Conrad was an immediate danger paired with responses that appeared to encourage continuation rather than intervention. The messages were not read in a vacuum. Investigators looked at context, prior attempts to get Conrad help, his history of depression, Michelle's awareness of that history, and her acknowledgement in later messages that she believed her words influenced what happened. One message to a friend, in which she described urging him not to turn back, became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the entire trial. It struck many as chilling, others as deeply sad, and still others as a sign of a teenager trying to make sense of something she could barely comprehend herself. But regardless of interpretation, it was impossible to ignore. Families on both sides were plunged into a storm that words can barely capture: grief, anger, guilt, and the slow-motion shock of legal proceedings unfolding in public view. Conrad's loved ones mourned a bright, complicated young man whose life had been derailed by inner turmoil and, they believed, by harmful influence at a moment of crisis. Michelle's family watched their daughter become the focus of national condemnation, painted in headlines as the embodiment of cruelty, even as they knew her as someone struggling, fallible, and young. Two sets of parents confronted the same fact from opposite ends. Everything can change because of what is typed on a screen. In the public imagination, dangerous word became a shorthand for the whole case. Commentators debated whether speech could ever be the basis for criminal liability without crossing into policing thought. Ethicists wrote about manipulation and responsibility. Psychologists spoke about contagion effects, codependency, and how isolation can warp judgment. Young people who read the story recognized something uncomfortably familiar: how fast conversations by text can escalate, how absolute statements feel in late-night chats, how messages can become a sealed world with its own logic. The power of Section 2 lies in this uneasy realization. There was no dramatic confrontation, no cinematic climax. There were messages, some pleading, some resigned, some forceful, some catastrophically misguided. What happened did not occur in one moment. It was built slowly through repetition, through the erosion of hesitation, through emotional framing that made an irreversible act seem like an answer instead of a warning sign. It shows how pressure can hide inside care, how manipulation can wear the mask of loyalty, and how the digital intimacy of adolescence can amplify both love and danger. By the time the final message was sent, the trajectory was set. The aftermath will belong to investigators, lawyers, and judges, but the harm was already done. The record left behind, cold lines of text preserved in databases, became the primary witness. Those words could not be unsent, could not be reinterpreted into something safer. They were what they were, fragments of a conversation that traced a path toward tragedy, and that would soon be read aloud in a courtroom where silence fell heavy after each line. The question that now loomed was no longer private or hypothetical. Could someone be held criminally responsible for encouraging another person to take their own life through messages? Where does free expression end and unlawful coercion begin? And how should the justice system respond to a case where the harm is real, the mechanism is language, and the participants are teenagers? Those questions will define the next chapter of the story, moving the narrative from phones to a courtroom, from secret text to public record, from personal crisis to national precedent. The courtroom became the place where private words were read aloud to strangers, where personal anguish was translated into exhibits, and where the boundaries of law were tested under fluorescent lights. Reporters lined the benches. Microphones waited outside. Inside, the atmosphere carried a heaviness that everyone could feel. A young man was gone. A young woman sat at the defendant's table, and the central evidence consisted not of fingerprints or ballistics, but of text messages and phone records. The prosecution's case revolved around a simple but unprecedented theory, that Michelle Carter's words constituted criminal conduct because they encouraged and pressured Conrad Roy at a moment when she knew he was in acute danger. They argued that she understood his vulnerability, recognized his hesitation, and nevertheless urged him forward rather than toward help. Prosecutors emphasized not only individual lines, but a pattern of sustained course of messages that framed his death as expected, even necessary, and discouraging him from seeking the support that might have saved him. In opening statements, they painted a portrait of Conrad as a troubled but conflicted teen who was wavering, looking repeatedly for reasons to stay. They highlighted messages in which he expressed fear, doubt, and concern for his family, and then juxtaposed those with Michelle's replies that appeared to override those doubts. They pointed to her later comments to friends, where she described the final exchanges in ways that suggested she believed her words mattered and that she had urged him not to retreat at the last moment. Those statements, they said, stripped any ambiguity away. The defense presented a very different narrative. Their central argument was that Conrad's death, however tragic, could not be legally attributed to Michelle. They argued that he had long struggled with mental health issues, had previously spoken about in his life, and ultimately made his own choice. Words, they insisted, should not be equated with physical causation. To criminalize speech in this way, they warned, risked punishing thoughts, conversations, or bad judgment in moments of emotional chaos. The Constitution's protection of expression lurked beneath every sentence they spoke. They also asked the court to see Michelle as more than a headline. They reminded everyone, a teenager with her own history of depression, counseling, and loneliness. They emphasized that she had at times encouraged Conrad to seek help, that she lacked maturity and life experience to grasp the full ramifications of what was unfolding, and that she became overwhelmed by events beyond her emotional capacity. The defense suggested that she clung to dramatic narratives, tragedy, martyrdom, rescue fantasies without fully understanding the dangers of taking those narratives seriously. Witnesses took the stand. Family members spoke about the Conrad they knew, intelligent, sensitive, struggling, loved. Their grief filled the room. Experts in psychology testified about suicidal ideation, ambivalence, and the powerful effect of encouragement or discouragement during a crisis. They explained that people in acute distress often oscillate rapidly between wanting to live and wanting relief, and that external voices can nudge them in one direction or another. That testimony became vital in helping the court interpret the text not as abstract words, but as influences on a mind in turmoil. Then came the messages themselves. Reading them in court required a slow cadence that made their impact heavier. Each line landed with a weight that written text rarely carries in private. Jurists and observers watched as conversations were projected, showing not only the content, but the timing, the closeness of messages to key moments, the way encouragement persisted despite hesitation, the way doubts were reframed as obstacles rather than lifelines. Silence in the courtroom often followed the end of the thread. One of the most discussed pieces of evidence was Michelle's post-event message to a friend, in which she described urging Conrad not to back out after he expressed fear. To many, that statement sounded like an admission of moral responsibility. To the court, it became part of the legal reasoning about her awareness and intent. The defense sought to contextualize it as the confused words of a teenager trying to process grief, guilt, or shock. The prosecution argued that it revealed knowledge and pressure at a decisive moment. The judge, not a jury, would ultimately decide. The trial became a national civics lesson in real time. Could speech, absent physical presence or force, cross into criminal conduct? Was this a unique confluence of facts, or the opening of a door that would change how digital communication is policed? Legal analysts debated whether conviction might chill difficult conversations about mental health, while others argued that failing to hold Michelle accountable would overlook the reality of psychological coercion. The public followed every development, often reacting emotionally long before the verdict arrived. Throughout the proceedings, one fact remained constant. Everyone agreed the loss of Conrad Roy was devastating. Where they diverged was on the meaning of Michelle's responsibility. The prosecution emphasized duty once she knew he was in crisis. They said she could have urged him toward life, toward treatment, toward immediate help. Instead, they argued, she did the opposite, reinforcing the most dangerous thoughts circling in his mind. The defense emphasized autonomy. Conrad's actions were ultimately his own, they said, and the law cannot criminalize one person's failure to use the right words in a tragic situation. The judge's verdict would echo far beyond the courtroom. Michelle Carter was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, based on the reasoning that her conduct, her words, her encouragement, her failure to act when she believed he was in immediate peril constituted reckless behavior that caused harm. The decision hinged on particular facts, particularly her knowledge of the crisis in real time, and her role in encouraging continuation rather than rescuing or summoning aid. It was not a blanket criminalization of harmful speech. It was a judgment about this case, this pattern, this convergence of circumstances. When the verdict was read, Michelle sat still, absorbing the reality that her messages had become the basis for a criminal conviction. Outside the courtroom, the reactions were swift and divided. Some called it justice, a recognition that words can wound as deeply as actions when directed at someone standing on the brink. Others warned of legal overreach, worrying that criminal law was extending into private conversations in ways that could set risky precedents. For Conrad's family, the law's outcome could never equal what was lost, but offered acknowledgement of harm and responsibility. Sentencing reflected that same tension between youth and accountability. Michelle's punishment included a term of incarceration combined with probationary conditions, recognizing both the seriousness of the conduct and her age at the time. The judge spoke of reckless behavior, avoidable tragedy, and a unique power of communication in the digital era. The sentence underscored that even in a world dominated by screens, legal responsibility does not disappear simply because harm is mediated by technology rather than by touch. Beyond the legal result, the trial forced a collective reckoning with uncomfortable questions. What obligations do we have when someone confides suicidal thoughts? How we talk about mental health in ways that are honest but not fatalistic? Where's the line between free expression and dangerous encouragement? The courtroom did not erase those questions. It made them unavoidable. It revealed how fragile teenagers can be when left alone with each other's pain, and how vast the consequences can become when no stabilizing adult presence intervenes. Section 3 is about that reckoning. It is the part of the story where language is weighed, not metaphorically but literally, as evidence. It shows a legal system grappling with realities for which it had few precedents, relationships lived on phones, crises unfolding in texts, and a culture where young people craft identities out of messages and images. It shows the faces of families in court, listening to intimate exchanges recited in public, reliving moments they would give anything to change. As the courtroom emptied and cameras packed away, the case did not end. Instead, it moved into broader society, into classrooms, law reviews, newsrooms, and families' dinner table conversations. The verdict had answered one legal question, but opened 100 cultural ones. What happened next would not be measured in pages of transcripts, but in the aftershocks that followed. Debates about responsibility, reforms in mental health awareness, and a lingering awareness that in the age of constant connection, words can carry a weight few had fully reckoned with before. The case did not end with a verdict. In many ways, that was where its longest life began. After the courtroom lights dimmed and the reporters moved on to the next headline, the story of Michelle Carter and Conrad Roy continued as a national conversation about responsibility, loneliness, law, technology, and the frightening power of words spoken at the wrong moment. The aftershock rippled outward through schools, families, courtrooms, and social media feeds, where strangers argued fiercely over two teenagers they had never met. One of the most immediate consequences was legal debate. Scholars, judges, and attorneys examined the reasoning behind the conviction, asking what it meant for future cases. Was Michelle's conduct a unique convergence of circumstances, or had the court drawn a broader line around language that encourages self-harm? Some argued that the law had finally acknowledged psychological coercion as real and consequential, particularly in the fragile context of adolescence. Others warned that the decision risked criminalizing speech in ways that could be stretched beyond the facts of this case, potentially chilling difficult conversations about mental health. What almost everyone agreed upon was this: the case illuminated a gap between laws written for a pre-digital world and the realities of 21st century communication. Statutes that contemplated physical proximity and direct action now had to contend with relationships lived through devices, where proximity is emotional rather than physical, and presence is measured in notifications rather than footsteps. Courts and legislatures began revisiting statutes on harassment, bullying, and assisted suicide, asking whether existing language captured the complexities revealed here. In some jurisdictions, proposals emerged to more clearly define when encouraging self-harm crosses into criminal territory. In others, lawmakers hesitated, wary of legislating speech too broadly. Beyond the legal journals, the public conversation turned toward mental health, especially among teenagers. Parents read the messages that had been quoted in the news and felt a piercing alarm. They saw how much a young person's inner life can unfold invisibly through private threads no adult ever sees. Schools organized assemblies, counselors visited classrooms, and awareness campaigns spoke about warning signs of suicidal ideation and the importance of seeking help. The case became a tragic example used in discussions about digital well-being, that technology can intensify isolation as easily as it connects, and that affirmation from a single peer can become dangerously powerful when it replaces broader support. For many young people, the story struck even closer to home. They recognized the late-night intensity of texting, the way small groups or couples can build a sealed emotional universe online, and how quickly dependency can form when one person becomes the sole confidant of another in distress. Some admitted that they had seen similar patterns, friends talking only to each other about dark thoughts, discouraging outside help out of fear of betrayal or drama. The case forced a difficult reckoning with the role peers play. When does being there become enabling, and when does loyalty silence life-saving intervention? The question of manipulation also lingered. The narrative of toxic dynamics and emotional control resonated with people who had experienced relationships in which words did not bruise a body, but nonetheless inflicted deep harm. Therapists and advocates discussed how vulnerable teens can conflate love with obligation or attention with worth, and how that confusion can be exploited even without conscious malice. Michelle's messages, sometimes comforting, sometimes pressuring, were studied as examples of how validation and coercion can blur, creating a subtle push that feels like support to the person delivering it. At the same time, another current ran through public reaction: compassion complicated by discomfort. Many people looked at photographs of Michelle and Conrad and saw not archetypes, but two young faces, each bearing more weight than adolescents should carry. It was possible to condemn harmful words while still recognizing that Michelle herself was also a teenager struggling with mental health, identity, and belonging. The story refused simple casting. There was no neat division into hero and villain. Instead, there were flawed humans, terrible choices, irreversible loss, and a legal system struggling to respond without losing sight of nuance. Media coverage added another dimension to the aftermath. Documentaries, podcasts, and articles revisited the case, sometimes emphasizing legal precedent, sometimes dramatizing the personal story. Each retelling shaped public perception a bit differently. Critics questioned whether constant retelling risked exploitation, turning tragedy into content. Others argued that discussing the case openly helped expose dangers of emotional manipulation, untreated depression, and the myth that digital conversation is less real than face-to-face interaction. Through it all, one ethical question persisted: how do we honor the memory of a life lost without turning it into spectacle? Conrad's family focused on remembrance rather than debate. They spoke about his intelligence, his sensitivity, his potential, and the future that would never come to pass. Their grief did not fit into legal categories or internet arguments. It was personal and immeasurable. Michelle's family, meanwhile, confronted the dual reality of loving someone who had caused harm and watching that person be publicly vilified. Both families had to live with a story the world felt entitled to discuss, while their own experience of it remained raw and private. The case also altered how many institutions talk about intervention. Counselors emphasize that when someone expresses suicidal thoughts, the appropriate response is not secrecy, but connection professionals, trusted adults, emergency services. Training programs began highlighting the danger of trying to handle alone, even with good intentions. The narrative that had once framed loyalty as silence increasingly gave way to a new one. That real care sometimes means breaking confidence to save a life. The story of Michelle and Conrad became a cautionary tale about the cost of isolation and the risk of framing death as a solution rather than a crisis demanding urgent help. Another lasting theme was the nature of digital evidence. The case demonstrated, painfully, that phones are not just tools of communication, but archives. Everything typed in moments of anger, confusion, or fantasy can later be read aloud in court, stripped of tone and context. That realization sparked reflection about responsibility in the age of permanent records. Words typed quickly may travel farther than intended, and their legal and moral consequences can outlast the impulse that produced them. Yet it would be simplistic to say the lesson is merely watch what you text. The deeper message is about empathy and responsibility in the face of another person's pain. The case asks each of us uncomfortable questions. If someone reveals deep despair, what do we owe them? If our words carry weight, how do we use that weight carefully? When does passivity become complicity? Those questions do not belong only to courts. They belong to friendships, families, and communities trying to prevent the next tragedy rather than merely adjudicate it afterward. Looking back, the story of Michelle Carter and Conrad Roy becomes less about a single verdict and more about a cultural turning point. It forced society to confront the reality that language, especially in the intimate, immediate format of texting, can function as action when directed at someone at the edge of crisis. It highlighted how vulnerable young people can be when mental health support systems fail to reach them, and how easily emotional dependence can replace professional help. It revealed the frightening speed at which small decisions, messages, and silences accumulate into consequences no one can reverse. Section 4 belongs to the world after the case, to the debates in classrooms, the reforms in counseling programs, the legal articles parsing responsibility, and the quiet conversations among parents and teenagers late at night. It is about a collective recalibration, recognizing that technology does not diminish moral responsibility, that compassion and accountability can coexist, and that preventing future harm requires more than punishment. It requires listening early, intervening bravely, and treating words not as harmless abstractions, but as forces capable of healing or harming. Ultimately, the legacy of this case is neither simple condemnation nor simple defense. It is a warning and a plea. A warning that words can push someone closer to the edge than we realize, and a plea to use those same words differently, to interrupt isolation, to call for help, to insist on life even when despair insists otherwise. Conrad Roy's death remains a tragedy that no verdict can undo. Michelle Carter's conviction stands as a reminder that responsibility does not vanish in digital space. Between those two realities lies a space where change can happen, where awareness becomes action, and where the next message sent to someone in crisis might be the one that pulls them back instead of pushing them forward.